Chinese history revolves around its dynasties and a lot around Confucianism. These dynasties, particularly the Sui dynasty, they embraced Confucianism, they embraced Hinduism and Taoism. These religions were more spiritual than Confucianism, and they forced Confucianism to change its ways. Now, folks, again, you find parallels in India where that Buddhism threatened Hinduism in India and forced Hinduism to change its ways, and in Christianity where that Protestantism threatened Catholicism and forced Catholicism to change its ways. Again, all this parallel history, parallels. What you find going on in one place, you find going on in another. Now, eventually, Taoism and, did I say Hinduism? Oh my, I'm sorry, correction, Buddhism.
Which culture is this?
This is in China.
This is which dynasty?
The Sui. And then the Tang and Song dynasties helped to bring Confucianism back. But Buddhism and Taoism threatened Confucianism during the days of the Sui dynasty, but Confucianism made its way back. And part of this was due to the effect of the, due to the fact that Confucianism reformed itself. Okay. Now, I will come back to talk about the religious in a moment, but again, I'm going by the way the book does it. The book digresses here from religion to the civil service exam. The civil service exam had not been used much in the days of the Tang dynasty. The Tang didn't, but then the Song dynasty, in order to get control, they went back to it. In other words, they came back under the Song. Why? Well, the Song dynasty felt like they could do a better job of picking the they could do a better job of picking government officials. Now, again, I know I said last class, that these emperors had to rule through nobility. They wouldn't have had to if they had had the internet, if they would have had telephones, telegraphs, and airplanes and things, but they didn't have these things, so they had to govern through the nobility. Well, who became a noble, and who got the government offices, this was determined by the civil service exam. Now, the problems with the civil service exam is that it was generally not fair. The poor, for instance, had no chance of passing the exam because there were no public schools. So only the rich could pass, only persons whose parents could afford to pay for tutors, or only the nobles, children of nobles could pass. Now, the other thing the Song dynasty did, they slanted the exam real strongly toward Confucian principles. Now, again, this was to get the people away from the more spiritual Buddhism and Taoism that has gone on under the Sui dynasty and get them back to Confucian principles because Confucius emphasized obedience to the state. Not to mention he emphasized hard work. Now, folk, oh yes, there was some cheating on the exams. Now, here is another problem with the exams. I'm going to bring up, more than 10 years ago, what I'm about to say, a student went right to my department head afterwards and told on me. And the department head wrote me a letter, and I wrote back. He could have spoken up in class, because I allow my students to speak freely. And I said, I do not base my grades on his opinions. And I told her that a Vietnamese communist had sat in my class and he made an A in my class. I've had Muslim people make A's in my class, and atheists, outright atheists, make A's in my class. They'll tell me what they believe. Make A's in my class, and I won't grade based on opinion, but I do give out my opinions. You're welcome to disagree. Anyway, here's the story of the exams, the way the Sui dynasty set them up. They were slanted toward Confucianism. You had to memorize large portions of Confucian writings in order to pass them. Well, what's so great about that? Well, here's this. In 20th and 21st century America, I know we're doing the same thing. We slant our tests. I'm talking about two tests. We took the graduate record test that gets you into graduate school, and the national teacher exam that used to be every teacher was required to take. I don't know if you still are or not. NTE. If you want to do well on them, give the most leftist answer you can when you have a choice. They're slanted towards liberalism, towards socialism, toward leftism. That's what I said, and that's what this person told me. Hey, I've been saying it ever since, except louder. And it's how come every college professor at Duke University, every history professor is a liberal socialist. I know somebody said liberal socialists are smarter than other people. Leave that if you will. Just ask anyone who got conquered by the Mongolians during the days of the Song dynasty that came later. But anyway, they slanted their test. They wanted to get their own people in office. They were people who had their philosophy. Also, it is known that emperors would hire Confucian advisors more than they would hire Buddhist or Taoist advisors. Now, something else I ran into when I was in graduate school. I went to the University of Tennessee. It appeared, the testing was always what they call a subjective test, the essay test. And we got the feeling that the professor could put any grade that the professor wanted to on the test. Unlike a multiple choice test where I run it through a machine, the machine does the grading. And everybody gets a grade based on their output, whether you're black or white or Catholic or Protestant or whatever. You're graded. With an essay test, folk, you don't know if the professor is planning his grade towards someone who has his favorite politics. Again, these civil service exams were essay tests. And the grading, that wasn't just that the students cheated. The graders oftentimes cheated in favor of the certain types of students. This is known. Now, the biggest cheating scandal we've had here in Atlanta in the last 10 years has involved not kids, but teachers. Yeah, some of you know what I'm talking about. Big cheating scandal involving teachers. All right. Anyway, civil service now. One of the problems, I mentioned how the Tang dynasty and the Song dynasty came after. Both dynasties took land from the rich and redistributed it among the poor. And guess what? In short order, the rich bought back the land that had been taken from them, and the poor lost it again. This has been a fact of life throughout history as dynasties have done this. Now, under these, I've got to say this, there was some good thing happening under the Song dynasty. Steel. Steel is stronger than iron. The Chinese invented steel. Steel came to widespread use. Cotton was introduced. Gunpowder was invented, and the gunpowder was used against this. Then it helped bring down the Song dynasty. But Steel is made mostly of iron, but it's lighter than iron and stronger than iron. And it can do a lot of things that iron simply cannot do. The Silk Road took Chinese products. Now, mostly the silk products did not get to Europe anymore. They had during the days of the Roman Empire, but there was a lot of trade between China and the Muslim world. Now, between China and between Europe lay the Muslim world. And the Muslim world kept Europeans from benefiting from Chinese trade for several generations. Eventually, though, Europeans developed better cannon and better weaponry, and they were able to, to keep the Muslim world at bay. The Silk Road, but travel on the Silk Road became dangerous. The mountains were steep, the deserts were dry, the bandits and outlaws were abundant, so the Chinese built ships. Now, it is believed that the Chinese they built wooden sailing vessels that were 450 feet long. Now, some folk have said this is impossible, but they would take teak wood and bury it in the ground for several years. Then after so you dig this teak back up, and the teak would become very hard. It was similar to our pressure treating, except it took a lot longer. But the teak would become very hard. They used this teak wood to build their ships. And Chinese sailing vessels got to California several years before Columbus did. You know, these people were on their way. They had developed a movable sail, the rudder. Anyone of you who know anything about sailing know, being able to move your sail is very important. You can even go against the wind. They invented the rudder. No, they were on their way. Now, granted, the trip from China to California is 10,000 miles. The trip across the Atlantic from Europe to the New World is only 4,000 miles. But the Chinese lost all interest in this. To make a long story short, well, let's see. Well, I've got to get into some of the things they invented first. They began to produce silk. And Europeans began to wonder, now how can we make silk? And if we can only find what kind of tree they used, and they imagined if silk came from a silk tree, hopefully all of you know better, no, silk comes from a certain kind of worm, the silkworm. And when Europeans discovered that and secretly stole some silkworms and brought them to Europe, they began producing silk themselves. But silk, porcelain is widely used as an insulator. It's used in dishes and cups, but it's also widely used in capacitors. It's used as an insulator in making electronic components. It's an excellent insulator. It will not conduct electricity very well. All right. China began to industrialize. Now, all this was to come to an end, but for all I've said about China being farmer, they started to industrialize. They were making steel, silks, porcelains, trading on the Silk Road, building huge ships. They set up banks, paper money. They invented the printing press. Both these inventions, should have propelled them to the top of the world. And in fact, if you could have visited the Earth from another planet in the year 1000, where you said these Chinese are going to be the ones who make the discoveries, you'd have thought so. And the last people you'd have guessed to do it would be the Western Europeans, whom you would hardly have noticed. But as it was, Chinese, folks, without banks, you cannot have large airplanes, you cannot have locomotives, you cannot have railroads. Without paper money, you cannot have a factory that employs 30,000 workers and pay them all. Without paper money, you cannot have a complex economy. The printing press, without it, you cannot get ideas. Airplanes are built from paperwork. I can tell you this much, I mean, you know, maybe if somebody said you're not supposed to tell. Well, to build a plane, we get out the paperwork, and go to the crib and check out the parts we needed and put the parts together, record the paperwork, then move it on to the next guy who would put our parts with us, some other parts, and made parts together. Paperwork, folk. Didn't ask old Mike, hey Mike, you put together a C-130 before, maybe you can put one now. No, there were 10,000 Mikes, Jills and Josephs and whatever. And they had to do it according to paperwork. All right. Family life, don't get me wrong, I'm getting back to the religious struggle, but family life, you did have some new landed people come in, new landed. In other words, poor people would all of a sudden become super rich, and the rich would become poor. Now, in the year 1900, someone did a survey of America's top 400 families, and they said, these 400 families by the year 2000 will control almost all of America's wealth, and the rest of the people will be left with nothing. 100 years went by. When the 400 years are over, somebody did a survey of what happened to all these 100 years. What happened to all these 400 families? Only 2 of them still had their money. The other 398, the money had all gone by the wayside. I've heard that the Kennedy family is slowly going broke. I mean, if you know any different, you're welcome to say so, but all that money that Joseph built up, by bootlegging, by the way. This is a fact. I mean, some of you might be hearing this for the first time. They built it up by bootlegging. So anyway, but new people came in, and the old nobility, a lot of them lost a lot of their money. And many a noble family has gone broke down through the ages. And even kings have gone bankrupt. Philip II of Spain went bankrupt. His son did also. The family unit was the mainstay of Chinese life, and you were considered family if you had the same great-great-grandparents. It wasn't just the same father and mother, but the same grand. I mean, if you're you and your brother and sister, your first cousins, second cousins, third cousins, all were considered part of the family. And mostly families lived in a village. And they worked the fields outside the village, which consisted mostly of rice. And the rice fields required teamwork, lots of it. Now, what I'm about to say applies to the 20th century. In time of famine, the Chinese would kill their female babies. I got one of these few heads to raise up. But the Chinese would kill their female babies because they felt like their female babies were expensive and an unnecessary expense, and they could do without it. This was wrong. Now, I say this applies because in the 20th century, the Chinese government, to try to curb population, passed a law that couples could only have 2 babies, and most couples then would kill their female babies to have someone to carry on the family name. So what happened? The young men grew up without their female counterparts and couldn't find wives. This actually happened during my lifetime. Several of you might have heard about it from other sources in this morning's class, a bunch of them had. But this actually went on. I've been told that people in India did the same thing. Now, that's not in your book, at least not that I've seen, but I had an Indian man tell me that the people of India used to do the same thing. Now, the young girls would have their feet bound from the time they were infants. Now, what do I mean by foot binding? Put a really tight shoe on their feet from the time they were not much more than born to change the shape of their legs, basically to cripple them. Believe it or not, the purpose was to make them more attractive to men. Now, I had an American student say, well, I don't find crippled women attractive. Well, fine and dandy, but the Chinese men did. All right, I'll put it to you as plain as I want to. The purpose was to make their legs look more attractive during the sex act. At least that's the stated purpose. But another person wrote an article recently that stated that the real purpose was to keep these young women from running off. That once crippled, they could not run off, and basically it was to make them subservient. Now, the nearest thing we have in the West to doing the same thing is Western women used to wear high-heeled shoes. I don't see that much anymore. Now, I have a wife and 2 daughters, and neither one of them have worn high heels. And high-heeled shoes led to problems with corns, bunions, plantar warts, ingrown toenails, fallen arches. Hopefully, none of you have any idea what I'm talking about. And if you don't ask, because you're blessed. Maybe some of you have more. And then I'll tell you something. I may even be a man. I have had ingrown toenail surgery 4 times, and a lot of it was due to the fact that when I was a kid, growing up in poverty, I had to wear shoes that were too tight for me, and wear my shoes too long, and that had a lot to do with it. But then again, my son had the same issue one time, and we took him to a podiatrist. I didn't go to a podiatrist until I was in my 30s and 40s when Lockheed would pay for most of it. Lockheed's insurance. That was when healthcare was a little bit better than it is. For some of us, was better than it is now. All right, that's a hot topic also. But anyway, the practice of foot binding was outlawed when the communists took over in 1949, the year I was born. Now, one of the men in my class this morning spoke up and said there are only 10 women left in the world whose feet are bound. The authors say that they visited China in 1980s and saw several women who had their feet bound young. Now, believe it or not, when the communist government outlawed the practice, it was the women who protested the loudest, not the men. The women. I mean, these older Chinese women said, their feminism will be destroyed. It's feminine to have your feet bound. I asked my mother one time, why do you women wear high-heeled shoes? Oh, it makes them look more attractive to the men. At least that's what she thought or what she said. Each is to each his own. I don't see as much of that anymore. Of course, I don't notice it either. But all right. There were a few Chinese women who gained prominence, and largely it was for being at the right place at the right time. Now, for instance, these two, one Chinese woman became practically the empress, became in charge of all China. She married the emperor. Her husband died young, but left a really young son who they crowned. They crowned his son officially as emperor, but he was too young to rule. So the mother took over as his regent. And she lasted with the regency for a good many years. This happened more than once throughout Chinese history, and it did throughout Egyptian history also. We talk about Queen Hatshepsut of Egypt, who took over when her husband died and left a son who was too young to assume the duties of royalty. All right. Now, I'm going to move now. Get back to the religion. Chinese religion is more of a philosophy, perhaps, than a religion. The book title is that section, In Search of the Way, or In Search of the Dao. Particularly, I want to emphasize 2 of the philosophers. Now, the Chinese #1 philosopher is Confucius. The #2 philosopher is Confucius' disciple Mencius. But then, later on, hundreds of years later, there came another philosopher named Chu Ci. I know that's not spelled the way I pronounced it, but this is the way your book pronounces it, Chu Ci. Before Chu Ci's time, there was a conflict because Buddhism and Confucianism were struggling to speed for mastery. And somebody got the ground and said, why can't we get Buddhism and Confucianism together and work out the differences and come up with one unified religion, reconcile Buddhism with Confucianism? A lot of persons are saying we can do the same thing today, that we can reconcile Christianity and Hinduism and Buddhism and communism and Marxism and all these. It has not worked. In the case of Buddhism emphasized contemplation, meditation, acceptance of what is. Confucianism emphasized hard work, go out and get them, and don't accept what is. Try to change it if you can. The 2 ideas would not reconcile. They've remained separate to this day. And, now, back to Chu Si. He collected all the philosophical works that had been done by Chinese even before, from the days of Confucius. He collected them all into several volumes. And this was made easier to be done because of the Chinese used the printing press. But anyway, he collected them. He was a neo-Confucianist. One of the things he said, though, was that we could get spiritual understanding by investigation. All right, and I could sit in the sidelines, I could cheer, hey, they're on their way. If they start investigating things, they're going to learn a lot. But we don't know what he meant now. An American scientist named George Washington Carver investigated the peanut, investigated the soybean, and he came up with all kinds of stuff that could be made out of soybeans and peanuts, including peanut butter, and including plastics from soybeans. But Chu Si's investigation of things did not bring about any kind of a scientific or spiritual revolution. The reason I mention that is his follower, Yang Wangmang, looked at a bamboo shoot, and he said, I spent weeks looking at this bamboo shoot, and I learned nothing, and I got nowhere, and it didn't profit me in the least. Well, if George Washington Carver had looked at that same bamboo shoot, I guess George Washington Carver would have made bamboo butter or some kind of plastic from it or whatever. I mean, all kinds of stuff. But George Washington Carver was not doing it for spiritual guidance. I mean, he was a convinced Christian. I mean, anyone who knows anything at all about him knows this about it. He was. But Chu Si was investigating just for the sheer purpose of getting some kind of spiritual insight. And again, in recent years, wanted to just what did he mean? And the same thing goes for a lot of his other writings. The writings about, we wish these people could come back and say, hey, what do you mean by this? What do you mean by that? He wasn't clear. Now, a lot of persons have wondered if these men, these philosophers, I mean, personally, now you all know, if you remember, I credit Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle with bringing down Western civilization to the Dark Ages. And a lot of people wonder these philosophers did not do the same thing in China, bring China down. However, before you think I'm completely negative on Chu Si, there is one thing I want to say in his defense. He believed strongly in morality. He was given a government job, and in his government job he clashed with the people, his fellow government employees, because he was exposing the corruption. They put him in his job like being a college teacher. I mean, he had a high score. He was a brilliant, he had a high score in the civil service exams. But then late in life, they got him back in the emperor's office again. He saw all the corruption of the emperor's office. He spoke out against this corruption.